There is an old saying in my family, "Thou who art undead art chosen, and thine exodus from the undead asylum maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords."
Hello Internet, your friendly neighborhood game machine here, and yeah, Souls games. They've been around for a long while now, and they're not going anywhere, even if you close down servers. But yeah, the Souls games. What's there really to say about the Souls games that hasn't been said already? Yeah, they're hard. Yeah, some are good, some are bad, and some are trash. You know, different stories, different pathways to take, different endings. But which Souls games are the best? Which are the worst? Which are the hardest? Well, today I have a group of people that have played Dark Souls games, or has at least heard of Dark Souls games. I will have these special people tell you the stories of the 4 games we're going to be talking about today. because this isn't going to be a review of a Souls game. This is to see which one truly is the best, the worst, and the hardest, not just in my opinion, but by surveys that I have taken, to even questions I have asked Souls streamers on both YouTube and Twitch. I'll be taking all the information that I took from all of these interviews and all of these tests that I've, compiled together, and we will put together a verdict on which Souls game is the best, which Souls game is the worst, and which is the hardest. I bet you're wondering, why am I not saying which Souls game is the easiest? Because there is no such thing as an easy Souls game. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started talking about the stories of the 4 games we're going to be talking about. So, we're going to be starting off with Demon Souls.
Demon Souls. The game is set in the fictional kingdom of Boletaria, ruled by the aging King Alot XII. Because of his greed, the king searched for power and prosperity through a dark ritual of channeling the power of souls that brought unprecedented prosperity to Boletaria, until the deep fog covered the land's outskirts, cutting off the kingdom from the outside world. Neighboring kingdoms sent scouts to investigate, but none returned after entering the fog. It was only after Valorfax of the royal twin fangs broke free from the fog that the rest of the world could be told of Boletaria's plight. By channeling souls, King Alot had awakened the Old One, a great demon residing below the Nexus. With the Old One's awakening, a dark fog had swept in, that within it unleashed demons who feasted on the souls of mankind, where those left alive without a soul became insane and violent. Without resistance, the fog slowly began to spread beyond Boletaria. Many brave warriors attempted to breach the fog and save Boletaria, while others were swayed at the prospect of harnessing the demon souls. Either way, many were lost to the fog. The player takes control of one such warrior, who breaches the fog and enters the Lost Kingdom. However, after entering the Palace Botanical Gardens, the protagonist is confronted by a vile demon, the Vanguard. If the protagonist manages to defeat the Vanguard, they are killed by the Dragon God, another vile demon in the form of a massive dragon. After dying, the protagonist, now in soul form, appears in the Nexus. In the Nexus, they are greeted by the Maiden in Black, a mysterious and blinded matron of the Nexus, who gives them the quest to travel to each region of Boletaria and retrieve the demon souls to gain power, and eventually free the corrupt kingdom of Boletaria from the Old One.
Dark Souls. A simple yet also complicated-like plot. The opening cutscene establishes the premise of the game. The world was once shrouded by grey fog and ruled by dragons. In this time period, Gwyn happens upon the first flame and finds a Lord Soul. He and his allies use their power to defeat the dragons, beginning the Age of Fire. Over time, the flames begin to fade with the rise of humans, and Gwyn sacrifices himself and his soul to prolong the Age of Fire. With the flame artificially rekindled, the undead curse begins to plague humanity, causing certain humans to continually resurrect upon death. The player character is a cursed undead, locked away in an undead asylum. After escaping the asylum, the player travels to Lordran to ring the Bells of Awakening. The bells awaken King Seeker Framt, who tells the player to ascend to Arnor Londo. In Arnor Londo, Guinevere instructs the player to succeed Lord Gwyn and fulfill the prophecy. To accomplish this, the Lord Souls must be acquired from Gwyn's primordial allies and returned to the flame. The player may encounter Darkstalker Kath, who encourages the player not to link the fire but to let it die out and usher in the Age of Dark. Once the player acquires the Lord Souls, they travel to the kiln of the First Flame to succeed Lord Gwyn.
The story of Dark Souls 2 begins with a human who has become undead, cursed to never die and doomed to eventually become a hollow, a zombie-like being with no memories or purpose. To break the curse, the undead travels to the fallen kingdom of Drangliak and is tasked by the Emerald Herald with obtaining 4 great souls from powerful old ones, whose names are long forgotten and forbidden. Once obtained, the Emerald Herald directs the undead to seek the king in the capital. After fighting through the remains of the royal guards, the player encounters the Queen Nashandra, who reveals that the king failed in his duty and fled his kingdom long ago. She asks the protagonist to slay the king. Near the end of the queen's quest, the player learns that the ruin of the kingdom was in fact caused by Nashandra. She came to the king and deceived him into launching an ill-fated invasion across the sea into the land of the giants. She coveted their souls and sought to steal their power. Though the raid succeeded in stealing the giants' unspecified power, the giants retaliated. Invading Drangliak, the giants eventually destroyed the kingdom. With his kingdom in ruins, the king discovered Nassandra's true purpose and locked himself inside the undead crypt. In order to confront Nassandra, the player character travels to the keep of Aldir, the king's brother, to obtain the Ashen Mist Heart, an artifact that allows a form of time travel by accessing the memories of corpses. The player must enter the memories of a deceased giant to defeat the giant lord during the invasion and claim his power for their own. Confronting the Emerald Herald one final time, she states that Nassandra is a fragment of Manos, the final boss in the Artorias of the Abyss expansion in Dark Souls. She then asks the protagonist to put Nashandra to rest and to link the fire, temporarily lifting the curse of the undead.
Dark Souls 3, set in the kingdom of Lothric. A bell has rung to signal that the first flame, responsible for maintaining the Age of Fire, is dying out. As has happened many times before, the coming of the Age of Dark produces the undead, cursed beings that rise up after death. The Age of Fire can be prolonged with the linking of the fires, a ritual in which great lords and heroes sacrifice their souls to rekindle the first flame. However, Prince Lothric, the chosen linker for this age, has abandoned his duty and instead chooses to watch the flame die from afar. The bell is the last hope for the Age of Fire, resurrecting previous Lords of Cinder, heroes who linked the flame in past ages, to attempt to link the fire again. However, all but one lord shirk their duty. The Ashen One, an undead who failed to become a Lord of Cinder called an Unkindled, rises and must link the fire by returning Prince Lothric and the defiant Lords of Cinder to their thrones in the Firelink Shrine. The lords include the Abyss Watchers, a legion of warriors sworn to protect the land from the Abyss and linked by a single soul, Yorm the Giant, who was once a conqueror of the very people for whom he then sacrificed his life, and Saint Aldrich of the Deep, who became a Lord of Cinder, despite his ravenous appetite for both men and gods. Lothric himself was raised in order to link the first flame, but rejected his destiny, leaving the task to his elder brother Lorien, who was crippled and driven mad as a result of the ritual. Once the Ashen One succeeds in returning Lothric and the Lords of Cinder to their thrones, they travel to the ruins of the Kiln of the First Flame. There, they encounter the Soul of Cinder, an amalgamation of all the previous Lords of Cinder who had linked the flame in the past. Once the Soul of Cinder is defeated, 4 endings are made possible based on the player's actions during the game. The player can attempt to link the fire, summon the Firekeeper to extinguish the flame and begin an Age of Dark, or kill her. A 4th ending consists of the Ashen One taking the flame for their own and becoming the Dark Lord of Londor.
So now that we got the 4 stories of the 4 games in question out of play, it's time that we get straight to the topic at hand. But I'm going to separate this topic into 2 parts though. The first part will be from what the public says, from forums I've found, to people I've asked in general, to even polls that I found, and just things of that nature. But basically I'm going to go by research in terms of the public's view on these 3 questions. In the second part, though, I'm going to give my own opinionated responses to these 3 questions. 3 questions at hand are: which Souls game is the best? Which is the worst? Which is the hardest? So, I say we go ahead and get started with the public's opinion on these 3 questions. First off, which Souls game is the best? Well, from asking certain people, to polls I've found, to even forums, it seems that people think that Dark Souls 3 is the best Souls game of the series. Simply because any type of gamer whatsoever could actually start Dark Souls 3, not feel too overwhelmed, but get an interesting experience nonetheless. It would give them the feeling of being able to, quote-unquote, get good at the game, while having many different doors able to be opened for that person in case they wanted to go into different classes when they started off as a regular. For example, if you decided to start off as a knight and you wanted to do some pyromancy on the side, you could get a pyromancy flame, you could do a knight combined with some pyromancy. You could even do a combination of sorcery and pyromancy if you wanted to. And from the research and everything, it seems that other people have said that the bosses are much more able to be dealt with in Dark Souls 3. People believe that it's interesting programming, and at the same time, it's an interesting story nonetheless. So when it comes to which Souls game is the best in terms of the community's response, it would have to be Dark Souls 3. From the community's response on what is the worst Souls game, it was a skyrocketing of 90% to 95% of all the forums and polls I did, and found that a lot of people agree that Dark Souls 2 is the worst game in the Souls series. The reason being, it's trying to be a carbon copy of Dark Souls 1, failed at it terribly. A lot of the bosses are cheap shoddy. A lot of the maps are interesting. There's a lot of glitches in Dark Souls 2. And at the same time, there's just a lot of just bad stuff in general that's wrong with Dark Souls 2. From the list that I found here, people believe that the bosses cheap shotted you all the way, which I can agree on. People believe that the human effigy system was absolutely terrible. People believed that the boss fights, aside from them being cheap shoddy, were not really very creative. A lot of the armor had issues, just things of that nature. There's actually a lot of stuff to list here in terms of why people believe that Dark Souls 2 is the worst. But I'm going by what the community responses are, and from the forums and polls, people in the public believe that Dark Souls 2 is the worst Dark Souls game. Okay, now to the nitty-gritty. What is the hardest Souls game? Well, the public responses were very interesting in this one. There was votes for all 4 of these titles, but the ones that got the most votes, it was almost a tie between 2 specific games. Okay? So, I had a lot of people say that Demon Souls was the hardest, simply because of one specific feature. The fact that if you had spirit form active for yourself, which happens when you die, your health is halved, which is pretty fucking bad. I understand that. Also, people believe that Dark Souls, as in the first Dark Souls, is considered the hardest, because you have a lot more you have to do in that game. You can easily get lost in certain situations, and you can be stuck behind a brick wall, if you catch my pun, in terms of boss fights and just ways of leveling up. So, Dark Souls actually won this by 30%, actually. It was actually an interesting tie between Demon Souls and Dark Souls. So it seems that the public believes that Dark Souls is the hardest game in the Souls games. which was very interesting to me, and I'll get to my opinion as to why. But it seems that people believed that there was far much more to do. Dark Souls was more overwhelming than Dark Souls 3. And at the same time, they felt that the bosses were cheap-shotty. Which is interesting because people in the forums believe that Dark Souls 2 was cheap-shotty. Which I can understand. Some of the bosses in Dark Souls can be cheap-shotty, but Dark Souls 2 is far worse. So it seems that the public believes that Dark Souls is the hardest game in the Souls series. Okay, so now it's time for me to put these findings aside here. And it's time for me to get to the unedited part of this whole thing. It's time for me to get in discussion of my opinions of these 3 questions. So, the whole Souls series. I bet people are wondering why I didn't put Bloodborne into this. Well, the last episode was Bloodborne. That was why. Bloodborne will always be my favorite Souls game. It's Soulsborne. It's being made by the same damn company. Soulsborne. So I decided that Bloodborne should have had its own episode before I even got with this one. And I did want to do an episode on Dark Souls. But at the same time, how was I going to be able to do it? Because each Souls game gives a little bit of good, a little bit of bad, or a whole lot of trash. So I thought about putting the 4 games together and seeing what not only the public believed, but also what I believe, which is what we're going to get to right now. So, before I go to which Souls game is the best, I'm going to go ahead and get the worst and hardest out of the way. So, I believe 100% that Dark Souls 2 is the worst. And I had a lot of rage with Dark Souls 2. I even streamed Dark Souls 2 on my Twitch account. You know, because I'm a live streamer. And, well, when it comes to Dark Souls 2, it tried to be good. It really did. I completely agree with what a lot of the forums were saying basically that Dark Souls 2 was trying to be a carbon copy of Dark Souls, and it just was not doing good. And I completely agree with that 100%. There was a couple good things about Dark Souls 2. You know, Majula was absolutely beautiful. A lot of the boss armors that you could get in the game were very creative. The Dragon Riders were actually a pretty interesting boss. They were bullshitty, but it was a good concept, you know. And, well, the Emerald Herald is a very pretty woman. Aside from that, and some of the creative weapons, that's about it. I mean, I had a lot of the bigger problems with bosses, like, for example, the Smelter Demon. I had some issues with him. I had some issues with just some of the bosses that just didn't even make any fucking sense. Like, even still to this day, when I think of Dark Souls 2, I think of how bad the freaking healing system is for that. Now, keep in mind, one small thing I do like about Dark Souls 2 is the life gems. Life gems are awesome. You can actually move a little bit while popping a gem to get yourself some healing going on. But why the flying fuck could you not move while healing with an Estus flask? Now, I understand that you stand, you know, idle when you heal with an Estus flask in Dark Souls 1. Okay? But how is it, and I've timed this with a stopwatch. How is it that you can you heal faster with an Estus flask in Dark Souls 1, but by 0.5 to 0.10 seconds, your healing is slower in Dark Souls 2 with an Estus flask? Somebody tell me why the fuck that is even possible. Alright? That's a great example of trying to replicate something and just doing an absolute fucking bad job with it, alright? Now, I could talk about Dark Souls 2 for hours. I know, because I've done it in my live streams on Twitch, okay? I have talked about it for hours, how much I fucking hate Dark Souls 2. But just in a nutshell, That's what I'm going to be leaving it as. Dark Souls 2 to me is the worst Souls game. Now, what's the hardest Souls game? What is the one Souls game to me that is the hardest? Well, that can actually be a pretty hard one for me. I'd probably have to say that it would have to go to Demon Souls. And I'm going to say why. Demon Souls was my first game ever in the Souls series that I've played. I still like Demon Souls, but then there's some bad stuff about it, okay? See, for example, the Nexus. Great place, okay? I think it's beautiful, alright? It was nice and everything, but the one thing that took away from me in Demon Souls was what's called spirit form. Okay, now the forums I went to and polls that I went to get my research for the public eye of the Souls games, they mention the spirit form, and I completely understand why this pissed people off. Because, okay, let's say you die in Dark Souls in human form, okay? You become hollow, or you basically can also become what's called an undead. And there's really no drawbacks. That's a good one. There's no drawbacks to being hollow, except for Dark Souls 2, because for some odd fucking reason, every time you die as a fucking hollow in Dark Souls 2, you keep losing health every time you die as a hollow, which was absolutely fucking stupid. But in Demon Souls, if you die in human form, your health is halved, and it stays halved. There is no going past the health of half or anything. You stay halved. Okay? That's just how it goes. That's just how it freaking goes. Some of the bosses can be a little bit of a pain in the ass. I remember I had a lot of issues with what was it? The Tower Giant. I believe he's the second boss in the game. He can be a bit of a bitch. You know, I still have issues with him when I played Demon Souls. Yes, I played Demon Souls on my PlayStation 3. Don't judge me. But in the end, you know, is it hard? Yes. It is very hard to adapt to Demon Souls. But at the same time, it's not the worst. Sooner or later, you get used to it. You know, it's... Like I said, there's nothing bad about Demon Souls. It's all about a person's experiences with it, okay? That's why when it came to the public eye, I stuck straight to my research, and I stuck straight to what other people said, and I compiled it all into, you know, verdicts of each of the 3 questions, okay? But the thing is, all my experiences with Demon Souls have been very, very hard. Now, I'll keep this in mind. I'm not going to spoil the first boss, but if you die to the first boss, either he cheap shotted you or you're fucking dumb as dirt, okay? But that's all I can really say about the hardest Souls game. I would actually have to give that to Demon Souls. Now, which Souls game is the best to me? What is the one Souls game that I love, okay? Now, I had people that are close to me and know me very well think that I would choose Dark Souls 3. And I mean, I completely understand why people would think that, you know, because Dark Souls 3 was the second Soulsborne game I ever platinumed on PlayStation. My first one being Bloodborne. I was absolutely ecstatic when that happened. And then when I got the platinum for Dark Souls 3, I was ecstatic about that. But do I think Dark Souls 3 is the best? Am I in the same community as the people that believe in public, the public view of the best Souls game? Do I think it's Dark Souls 3? Here's where that pause happens. Where I have people, you know, in suspense. No. I do not think that Dark Souls 3 is the best Souls game. I think Dark Souls 1 is the best Souls game. Or I guess you could say Dark Souls Remastered. And I'm going to tell you specifically why I think this. Now keep in mind, this is my opinion. This is my views of the game. Okay? Everybody is entitled to their own opinion. Hence why for this review I did both the public's opinion and I'm also going to be doing mine. I believe that Dark Souls Remastered or Dark Souls 1 is the best Souls game because of the challenge factor that it gives. I also love the fact that the bosses have a lot of linear to them. Each experience you have with a boss in Dark Souls 1 is always a little bit different. Now in Dark Souls 3 it's the same thing, but at the same time I just like the fact that Dark Souls gives you the pathway of a chosen one. Now, yes, Dark Souls 3 also has that as well, but at the same time, it's more of a luck-based thing when you play as your character in Dark Souls 3 and going down the pathway you have to take to defeat the so-called Lords of Cinder in order to, you know, go to the kiln of the first flame and go and fight the Soul of Cinder. Okay? But with Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls Remastered, whichever you want to say, I'm just going to say Dark Souls 1. Okay? When it comes to Dark Souls 1, it really gives you that factor where it's like you need to try if you really want to get to the end of this game. Or at least to the middle of this game. Okay? I remember the first time I ever fought the Tauros demon. I don't know how lucky I got, but I ended up killing the Tauros demon on my first try. Now this is back in 2011, 2012. This is when Dark Souls 1 came out for me. And it was hard because I didn't know what summoning was. I literally did Dark Souls 1 all by myself. I didn't know how to summon people. I was mostly hollow throughout the whole thing. You know, I just didn't know how to play the game. And I ended up beating Dark Souls 1 by myself. And I believe I was under level 100. I was under level 100 and I played as a knight class. Yes, I played as a knight class my first time. Which, of course, in the beginning of the game was one of the worst experiences of my life because of what's called fat rolling. And I didn't know what that was back then. You know, I was so used to Demon Souls. I didn't know what that meant. But I remember when I killed the Iron Golem and got to Anor Londo. I got very emotional when I got to Anor Londo because back in the day in 2011, 2012, if you got to Anor Londo, you could happily say that you beat half of Dark Souls. And that's where you would give yourself a pat on the back. And it was an amazing experience. One of the hardest bosses I ever fought in Dark Souls 1 would have to have been Ornstein and Schmo. Because you're fighting two motherfuckers at the same time. And then there's also a phase 2 to that fight. I'm like, goddamn. But I guess you could say it was the experiences that I had. You know, some of the experiences were amazing, some of them were good, and then there was a small percentage that were bad. Trying to get through Blighttown in the original Dark Souls 1 before it was remastered was an absolute pain in the ass. Oh my god. There was so many frame rate issues. It was so dark. You know, I didn't know what the fuck I was getting myself into. And I'ma tell you what, I had one of the biggest losing streaks against Quelaag around that time. Like, I died so many times to Quelaag, it wasn't even fucking funny. There was times where I felt like throwing my damn controller because of what had happened. But it was the fact that I experienced Dark Souls by myself, and then when when From Software remastered Dark Souls, I was like, I can show people what I went through back in the day while doing something new, which is why when I did my Dark Souls Remastered playthrough on my Twitch, I mostly summoned for every boss because I never experienced summoning back in the day. So, you know, I summoned for almost every boss, but I fought Gwen solo at the end of Dark Souls Remastered. And even then, it was an amazing experience. And I guess you could say now, I'm more addicted to Dark Souls Remastered than Dark Souls 3. Now, I'm not saying that Dark Souls 3 is a bad game. It's not a bad game. I'm not even going to say it's too easy. I'm just going to say that it didn't fulfill all of the wishes that I wanted it to give me. There was stuff that I complained about in Dark Souls 3 that some people remember. I used to complain about how, just some of the bosses, they didn't give too much of a fight. They were just mostly intimidating. Now, I'm not going to say that the Lords of Cinder boss fights weren't intimidating. Oh, yeah, they were. But it was more of a luck factor when it came to these bosses. Like, for example, if you look into the lore, you would know that the Abyss Watchers, for example, it wasn't just one Abyss Watcher. It was a whole army of Abyss Watchers. The boss, when you would think of that, you would be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna literally have to fight an army of Abyss Watchers to get the cinders of a lord. No, you go in there when the Abyss Watchers are basically killing themselves out of boredom. Okay. Now, okay, let me give you another example. Eldritch of the Deep. Alright, so Eldritch is basically in a nutshell, a giant slime that consumes beings and quote-unquote gods, even though Eldritch only consumes, now I'm not saying consumed, consumes one god, and that is Gwendolyn. When you go into the fight with Eldritch in Dark Souls 3, you're basically interrupting Eldritch consuming Gwendolyn. Eldritch has not fully consumed Gwendolyn, as Gwendolyn's body is still able to be seen protruding out of the body of Eldritch. Okay? So, in a way, you're interrupting the feeding time of Eldritch. Now, imagine if you got in there after he was done consuming Gwendolyn. I bet you it would have been a harder fight. Okay, it would have been a harder fight. Now, don't even get me started on Yorm. Okay? Don't even get me started on that, because how do you defeat Yorm? Okay, you can fight Yorm regularly, alright? But they basically give you a weapon in the room that you can defeat Yorm the easiest with. It's like making a knife really hot and putting it through a frozen stick of butter. It's gonna go right through, okay? That's exactly how that was. Alright? Now, I will say that one of the hardest Cinders of a Lord boss fights I have ever dealt with was going against Lorien and Lothric, the twins. Okay? I'll admit, the second phase is pretty fucking cheap, alright? Where the brother lashes himself onto Lorien and basically heals him every time he's down. That was cheap, and I've even said that it was cheap, okay? There's a lot of cheap boss fights. There's a lot of bad boss fights in Dark Souls 3. But still, at the same time, a lot of my favorite boss fights, one of them, I'd have to say, is against the Soul of Cinder at the end of the game. I love fighting the Soul of Cinder. It's absolutely fun. As much as I don't like fighting this next boss by myself, I like helping people fight the Nameless King. That is an example of a boss fight that was very overwhelming to people in Dark Souls 3. The fight with the Nameless King felt like a Dark Souls Remastered fight. That's why I got very, very salty when I played Dark Souls 3 and I went against, the Nameless King. And I'm not even going to get started talking about Midir. It took me 6+ hours to kill Midir, and we're not going to talk about that. We're going to go back to Remastered for a minute here, okay? The reason why Dark Souls Remastered is, to me, the best Souls game in the series is because you never forget the experience you went through it, in terms of my opinion, and you just keep coming back to it. You keep coming up with ideas to test yourself. You know, keep in mind, this is coming from the opinion of myself. I like a good challenge. I felt that Dark Souls Remastered gave me more of a challenge than Dark Souls 3. Plus, at the same time, I have much more knowledge in Dark Souls Remastered than I have in Dark Souls 3. Because, well, you know, I just feel it's more fleshed out in Dark Souls Remastered. Plus, at the same time, you know, if you compare Anne Orlando in Dark Souls 3 to Anne Orlando in Dark Souls Remastered, it's most definitely not the same. And when I got to experience Anne Orlando again in Dark Souls Remastered, it was an amazing experience, just like it was back then. And still, when I stream Dark Souls Remastered, it's still an absolutely amazing experience. You know, it's lovely. It's very lovely, and I like it. So, in conclusion, which Souls game is the best in my opinion? Dark Souls Remastered. Which Souls game is the worst, in my opinion? Dark Souls 2. Which Souls game is considered the hardest? Demon Souls. So yeah, that's what it's come down to. So, thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw today and you learned something new and everything, click the like button. Leave a nice positive comment down below. Do not forget to check the description of this video for links to MandaLynn, MariaTheGerman, Luna Sanguine, and binaryBrandon, and their Twitch channels down there. You know, go show them some love, okay? And I'm going to say this right now. I'm sorry that this part was not that much edited or anything. I like being able to give my opinion without jump cuts and everything. I hope people will understand. But until the next video, I'm your friendly neighborhood game machine, and I'll see you next time.